by just saying overall, we did a sort of a paper looking at various classification schemes of altered states of consciousness. And the idea was to do a bit of historical review, but not just a review, to also kind of synthesize them in sort of a meaningful way. And so this is the preprint that we have. So it was me, Timo, our colleague Cyril at Freiburg, Mark Whitman at Freiburg, and also my PI, Athena Demirci. The idea here was to have a sort of, it's laid out in these ways of having this, we're going to go through a background of why we're doing this. We're then going to go into these state-based schemes, method-based schemes, and neurophysio-based schemes. And the idea is that in the end, we will synthesize across all these reviewed types of schemes to propose an informal core features of altered states of consciousness. So what is implicated phenomenologically in an altered state of consciousness? So why would we study altered states of consciousness in the first place? Well, there are some clinical applications. So recently there's been a rise in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And the question here of importance is, are there clinically relevant dimensions of experience, right? So what about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is implicated in its positive clinical outcomes, right? It's beyond just the pharmacological chemical composition of the drug. There is something else going on there, whether it has to do with feelings of insight, ego dissolution, or what have you. There is also clinical relevance into computational psychiatry. So how can we understand this sort of changed information flow in altered states that we can use to inform diseases and psychiatric illnesses? So for example, we'll go over some classification schemes that detail mathematically how neuronal signaling is happening. Altered states give us sort of a controlled way to look at that. And this kind of transitions into this empirical arm of it as well, which is that we can use induction methods as tools to possibly locate neurocorrelates of consciousness. So structures that can be linked to a phenomenological outcome. So for example, the thalamocortical loop disruption there being linked to the production of hallucinatory phenomenon. Or we can also use it philosophically for the identification of invariant phenomenological structures of consciousness. That's just a very fancy way of saying how many dimensions of experience are comprised in a state of consciousness, right? So we can kind of do this to figure that out. Throughout history, there have been a lot of different terminology used to refer to altered states of consciousness. And even now there is some debate on which ones we're going to use, right? So we choose to use the classical term of altered states of consciousness. And this is the one that is primarily used even now. I would say it is used the most, but certainly it is mostly used throughout history. You may also see modified states of consciousness. I've been seeing a push for non-ordinary states of consciousness, which is you might run into this one more nowadays, right? It seems like this is the push to change it to non-ordinary. You may also see patterns of phenomenological properties, referring to the overall state. You might see exceptional states, modulated states of consciousness, expanded states of consciousness, higher states of consciousness, and sometimes even primary states of consciousness as well. So as you can see, not really a lot of agreement on the specific terms that we should use. I'm not really sure if there's actually even been much of a debate detailed specifically on which one we should use. I think it would be very helpful at this point, but going with historical accuracy and going what has mostly been used, we will be using altered states of consciousness. You can also see that there is terminology for ASC specific states, right? Or for phenomenologically specific states. So psychedelic states, referring to only those that are induced by psychedelic drugs, right? You have hallucinogen-induced altered states of consciousness, kind of similar, right? So only hallucinogens. Holotropic states of consciousness by Groff, and this refers to those that have very intense phenomenology. So you have a very intense experience under it. Think high doses of LSD or DMT, something like that. Exalted states, which Fisher uses to kind of talk about very powerful states on his perception continuum, which we'll talk about. Then also mystical, spiritual, religious states, those that induce that mystical experience, or meditative states, referring to those that are sometimes reached in meditative practices. So at the end, we need to sort of have defining criteria for what an altered state is if we're going to talk about classification schemes. So one of the first things we suggest as a defining criteria through all the things that we've reviewed is that they are first and foremost changes in subjective experiences that are noticeable from the first person perspective. Secondly, they are temporary, transient, and reversible, so they don't last very long. And thirdly, you need to have multiple aspects of consciousness affected at the same time. So these are sometimes referred to as multidimensional constructs, multivariate configurations, or phenomenological patterns. So there needs to be a significant deviation from the ordinary, normal, default baseline state, right? This is how you're going to have that noticeable difference from the first person perspective. But this entails some problems. So first and foremost is a reference problem, which is how is normal defined? And you can see this arise when people suggest that a psychiatric condition should be an altered state of consciousness, right? Because how can it be an altered state of consciousness if the person with the psychiatric illness does not have a baseline state as a reference? Therefore, the altered state can only be inferred when you're comparing it from a baseline normal waking state, which is usually the reference. There could also be this threshold specificity problem, which isn't in the paper, but it kind of came to me as I was working on these slides, which is, well, what is considered significant? We haven't really worked towards establishing a point of deviation, right? So a suggestion would be that, yes, of course, there needs to be multidimensional changes, but which dimensions and to what degree do those dimensions need to be altered for us to say, okay, yes, there's an altered state? Normally, most people go with the idea that if somebody says they're having an altered state, they likely are. And this stems from an idea that altered states are primarily psychological constructs, which we'll come to later. So there is a difference between an altered state and its induction method, and this is really important. A state cannot be inferred by the presence of its induction method. So if you do a meditation, you are not always going to go into a meditative state. Similar to the way that not everybody would go into a hypnotic trance or hypnotic state at the presence of a hypnotic induction. And different methods can induce similar states. So, for example, a state of sedation can be induced by physical exhaustion or sedative drugs. So, from this, the description of a state of consciousness should be primarily based on their subjective effects and supported by descriptions in neurobiological or physiological state. So, as I mentioned previously, altered states of consciousness are primarily a psychological construct, and they need to be inferred primarily from differences in subjective effects. So, with the history of altered states of consciousness looking forward, now that we sort of have an idea of what they are, we can say that the formal classification of these in modern science began in the 1960s. And from looking through that whole time period from then until now, we have been able to sort of have types of classification schemes. And the three that we've sort of found were state-based schemes that describe the experience of being in an altered state, method-based schemes that describe how one enters an altered state, and neurophysio-based schemes that imply classifications through identifying neurobiological, physiological markers of altered states of consciousness. So beginning with the state-based classification schemes, we should note that altered states of consciousness share phenomenal features. These are subjective features, right? So you have Moreau de Tour speaking about this in 1845. You have William James speaking about this in Varieties of Religious Experience, where he experimented a lot with ether and nitrous oxide and alcohol and wrote about how those things were sharing some sort of effects on his cognitive state of mind. And then this is also more formally referred to as the etiology independence hypothesis by Dietrich, which assumes that all altered states of consciousness share something, right? So regardless, etiology independence, regardless of their induction, they share changed effects at the phenomenal level. So state-based schemes identify these shared dimensions of experience, and this represents the most prominent type of classification scheme present in the literature. So most of classification schemes on altered states of consciousness have been regarding state-based things, right? They've been looking at shared dimensions of experience. These can be viewed as either conceptual, right? So they're merging together ideas of implicated dimensions based on either armchair philosophy. So someone just sat down and said, I think these things represent an altered state of consciousness. This can be done by literature review. So somebody who's been reading a bunch of research and writing on altered states and says, these comprise all the dimensions of experience in altered states. Or underpowered data collection, somebody just gave their class a survey. What do you think represents altered states? Or somebody did self-study on themselves with LSD in a flotation tank and said, this is what I think represents the experience of altered states. Then you also have empirical types. And these extend that conceptual work into psychometrics via questionnaire construction and refinement following test theory. So this is just you take a bunch of data collected on large samples, you have test items, those are revised from the incoming data, you then add or subtract dimensions based on statistical testing. And this, we go over some of these as well. But you either have conceptual or empirical state-based. And every empirical one is also conceptual, right? Because empirical just represents the evolution of a conceptual state-based scheme. So talking about these phenomenal features, you're also going to find more varying terminology, right? So I said subjective features, phenomenal features. You'll see dimensions, properties, aspects, facets, characteristics, structures, subsystems or divisions, features, domains. And if you're referring to an overall set, as a set of dimensional changes, they could be called phenomenological or experiential patterns, right? Now, you'll even notice that sometimes the same authors in the same paper use different terms. So Ludwig is a good example. In one paper, he calls them facets, then he calls them characteristics. And again, there's not really a debate yet entailed on, is there one specific term we should be using? I think the most important thing here is to look at this term referring to an overall set, right? Moving forward as we talk about consciousness, state space, and things like that, that it's important to know that the arising of the phenomenological experiential pattern terminology is to describe a whole set of experiences as they relate to an induction method or something like that. So we're going to start with a timeline here to show you the state-based ones. As I said, they are the most prominent in the literature. There's a lot more of these types of schemes, and so they kind of needed a little historical timeline here. You can see in 1963, we begin with the categories of a typology of mysticism, which will be the first one we talk about. And then most recently, we had this three-dimensional typology of altered states around 2017. But you can see that in the 1960s up to the 1970s, a lot of these things were being proposed. And then it sort of slowed down in the 80s. This is because around the 80s and the end of the 70s, you actually had the proposal of some questionnaires that started going through revision, right? And then as you got way more near the end to the 2000s, you started seeing the emergence of more of these consciousness state space ideas had been started floating around. But the majority of these schemes were proposed in the 60s and early 70s. Which is when it really took off. So beginning with the categories of a typology of mysticism, this is actually the conceptual framework that underlies the MEQ, which is a very popular psychometric instrument. It's used a lot in research looking at the clinical benefit of psychedelic psycho-assisted therapy, with the idea that the emergence of a mystical experience in an altered state of consciousness is the thing that makes it clinically relevant, right? And in 1963, we can see the mystical experience questionnaire appear first in Walter Ponka's thesis. And then this questionnaire was extended and revised psychometrically by others like William Richards, MacLean and colleagues, Strickling and colleagues. But it will be linked to its key publication, Drugs and Mysticism in 1963, which is the thesis of Walter Ponka. And Walter Ponka was a minister. He was a student who was actually working under Timothy Leary, who we will talk about, I think, following this. And he supposed in the original MEQ that there were 9 dimensions of mysticism. So this is unity, transcendence of time and space, deeply felt positive mood, sense of sacredness, objectivity and reality, paradoxicality, alleged ineffability, persisting positive changes in attitude and behavior, and transiency. The ones in bold represent the dimensions that remain in the most revised version. Right now, the MEQ4 you can see in 2024 they had an MEQ4 scale, and those are in that one as well. But the idea I mentioned before in these more empirical state-based schemes, they go through this psychometric revision as the MEQ did. Now, moving on to Ponca's advisor, Timothy Leary, he was a clinical psychologist and political figure who had a lot of previous work on personality theory. Now, he worked at Harvard, and then at some time in the early 60s, he went to Mexico and did mushrooms. And when he came back to Harvard, he had the idea to start the psilocybin project. And then Harvard then began investigating altered states of consciousness through magic mushrooms. This led to Ponca's sort of research, which was involving the miracle at Marsh Chapel. So he basically was trying to test religiosity in a group of people at a church who either took magic mushrooms or who did not. And this became a very famous experiment. Leary ended up getting fired from Harvard after being accused of giving drugs to students. And after that, around that time in the late 60s, he wrote tons of books. And one of these does suggest a very crude, very basic state-based scheme. It is unidimensional. He does not name it, but we will refer to it basically as the subjective intensity scheme, because what it does is it assumes there are levels of subjective intensity that can be reached through altered states, right? And his reason for supporting these levels is driven really by his reading of religious texts and his own self-experimentation. And if you read Leary's books, you will see that he actually proposes these and then says to the reader very blankly, if you do not believe me, try it yourself, take the mushrooms, and you will find these levels. And it's actually comical to the point where he writes, do it yourself or try it yourself in bold as like a little fun section at the end of his writings. And in these levels, he has this very low anesthetic state. So like alcohol can kind of go here to emotional stupor. You're kind of blurred all the way to this thing called the AE state, which he calls the atomic electronic state, which is the most intense state that one could ever reach. And he says DMT is one way of getting there. But again, this is a unidimensional proposition. It just goes on one axis, up and down on intensity. Now, a really important one that came a little bit after this in 1966 is Arnold Ludwig's altered states of consciousness. Now, Arnold Ludwig was a psychiatrist. He was a researcher who investigated hypnosis, schizophrenia, and importantly, witchcraft. That's always a fun thing to throw in there. He suggested that there were 10 characteristics of altered states of consciousness that were kind of shared across inductions. Now, this is actually really important because in the early 60s and into the 70s, most people were talking about altered states of consciousness only in how they related to drugs. Ludwig at this time was very unique because he doesn't say that these things are unique to drugs. In fact, later in the paper, he details some things that lead to altered states of consciousness. So he is kind of unique at this time period for saying, altered states of consciousness go beyond just drugs, right? And he's suggesting that, there's alterations in thinking, disturbed time sense, loss of control, change in emotional expression, body image change, perceptual distortions, change in meaning or significance, sense of the ineffable, so things that you can't discuss because they're so awe-inspiring, feelings of rejuvenation, and hypersuggestibility. Now, moving into the early 70s, we have Roland Fisher, who was a chemist who studied LSD as a model psychosis for schizophrenia. Now, he proposed the cartography of ecstatic and meditative states in 1971. It did go through some revisions in the late 90s. Now, the idea is that he really wanted to integrate altered states with this idea of phenomenal or subjective arousal, right? So how excited does one feel? How aroused are they? And he created this sort of spectrum that had hyperarousal at one end and hypoarousal at the other end. Now, he uses very unique terminology for this. So hyperarousal, he refers to as ergotropic, and hypoarousal, this is the underaroused, he refers to trophotropic. And this is also partly inspired by Buddhism. As you can see on the left, you can see that we have very specific Buddhist terms in this tranquil, hyper-aroused state. You have Zazen, Dharma, Dhyan, and Savichar Samadhi, for example. These are explicitly taken from Buddhist texts. So, for example, you can see ecstatic represents an exalted state. So Fisher would refer to the states at the very end of the spectrums as exalted. So ecstatic would be the exalted for hyper-aroused. Hypo-aroused would be the exalted for that one, for the trophotropic. And below these, you have these, what we call like arousal substates. So mystical rapture is the arousal substate of ecstatic, right? So this would be the most intense ergotropic experience that involves feelings of mystical rapture. And you move from the conception of the I around to the conception of the self. So your idea of your outward projections of the world, how you feel connected to the world outside, has now started to morph into you're looking more inward, right? And this happens as you increase either hyper-aroused or increased hypo-aroused. Around still in the 70s here, we have the Erica system. It is actually named from the desert in which it was founded. John C. Lilly, who was a biologist, psychoanalyst, physician, and neuroscientist, who importantly invented the flotation tank, worked with a mystic named Oscar Ichazo and went on these retreats. And in these retreats, Lilly was writing down things that Ichazo was telling him, and he sort of mapped out this two-dimensional scheme here, right? I like to think of this as kind of in some ways theoretically building on the very crude thing we saw with Leary, because what you can see in this two-dimensional system here is that subjective intensity is an axis. It's actually the x-axis here. And if you take out emotional valence, you basically have what Leary was doing, right? So how intense does the altered state feel? And then the y-axis here is the emotional valence. So is it positive or is it very negative, right? And the key publication that shows this is The Center of the Cyclone. It came out in 72. It's actually an autobiography written by John C. Lilly that details his experiences through this. So the numbering here is kind of strange. He bases it on Gurdjieffian vibrational frequencies. We try not to get too much into that even in the paper, but it is what these numbers represent. So how excited, how much energy is being contained in these states. It itself is also partly inspired by Buddhism, as you can see with names like Satori. And our good example here is that the strongest state, what would be the AE state for Leary, would be, for example, one of the Satori states. So the positive classical Satori state, which would be this really heaven feeling on something like DMT. And then you have this negative classical Satori state, which would be like this hell, you're seeing demons and you don't feel like you can escape and that the end is very near. And he details both of these experiences in that book. We then are moving on with the varieties of transpersonal experience as suggested by Stanislav Grof. He was a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist who researched shamanism, near-death experiences, and the clinical use of LSD. He worked a lot in therapeutic settings with this. So basically what he did was he grouped a bunch of narrative trip reports from his clients in LSD psychotherapy. So this isn't classically a state-based scheme in the sense that it's proposing dimensions, but it is sort of inadvertently proposing them by grouping these sort of self-reports on somebody's trip, right? So a good example here is that he classifies deity encounters, so are you seeing gods or demons, as something that he calls beyond objective reality. So this is something that he is assuming is not objectively true. And then he says that perinatal experiences are within objective reality as they're feasibly true, and they represent an expansion of time. Now, to just expand on that a little bit, because deity encounters, I think you would understand what I'm talking about, but perinatal experiences are a little different. So perinatal experiences are what Grof talks about in referring to into rebirth. So one feels that they're going through being born again. So from going through conception, through being in the womb, through breaking out. And because this is putting you at different time points within your life, it's expanding your concept of time. So he refers to it as a temporal expansion. He says it's within objective reality because it is feasible. You were a child at one point. You were in the womb at one point. So moving on to Ken Wilber's spectrum of consciousness. He was a transpersonal theorist who wrote on mysticism and unifying fields of knowledge. He's proposing this psychologia perennis. This was his key publication about it, which is a theory of everything in psychology. And the idea is that you have this diagonal line represents the self, and the self is split by these sort of dualities, right? So each level of consciousness, as you see on the right, you have shadow level, ego level, existential level, and mind level. Are defined by different dualities of identity. So these are Jungian terms. So for persona and shadow, so like the self that you show and the self that you don't show, your connection to your sense of self and your body at the ego level, your connection to the total organism related to the environment at the existential level. And then at the top, you notice that this thick diagonal line sort of becomes thinner and dotted. dashed, and it kind of turns into this thing called universe. So the idea is that as you increase in subjective intensity here, as you're going up in altered states of consciousness, you will dissolve all dualities and become sort of and feel this universe thing, right? So there's no longer any dualities. Everything is just one thing. And you notice that between these levels, there are these bands, and these bands just represent how things are transitioning. So the bands represent how one transitions from one level to the next. This one is missing the philosophic bands, which is in the paper. The corrected figure is in there. There is a bands between the shadow level and the ego level as well. So each level has a set of bands indicating there is a transitional change between the two, right? That would happen as you increase in altered state intensity. Then we'll move later on into the 70s with Charles Tart and his subsystems of altered states of consciousness. Charles Tart was a psychologist and parapsychologist. He studied hypnosis, marijuana, and he devised what we would talk about later, the very important systems model of altered states of consciousness. He did also do a lot of work with parapsychology. Basically, what he's showing here is you have a lot of different dimensions that are implicated, what he calls subsystems. So he says exteroception, interoception, input processing, emotions, memory, space and time sense of identity, evaluation, motor output, and subconscious. And the idea is that all of these work into awareness to differing degrees. There is some sort of main pathway of input processing. That means the incoming sensory information gets thrown to awareness. It then gets evaluated and is shown in activity and behavior through motor output. But the idea is that all these different implicated subsystems are all informing this main route of information to different ways. And then once behavior is done in the outside world, so this black box here represents the motor output being acted on in the world, there is a feedback loop that happens via your own body and via the external world that comes back and exerts physical world input or body input back onto exteroception and interoception. And then all these things start getting changed again, right? So you take LSD, your input processing is disrupted, your awareness of this is disrupted, you're evaluating the changes in awareness that are happening to your memory, your sense of identity, your emotions, your space-time sense, and then it's turning into some sort of motor output. And how you're interacting with the world around you, how you're interacting with your body is going to produce feedback that comes back and keeps this loop happening. So it keeps these sort of subsystems relevant in altered states of consciousness because they can all inform awareness. We'll move on here to the etiology-independent structures of altered states of consciousness. This might actually be one of the most important ones we'll talk about because of the empirical use of the 5-DASC. This is the conceptual framework behind the 5-DASC, which is an extremely prominent scale used in altered states of consciousness research. It was originally suggested by Adolf Dietrich. It was extended and revised psychometrically by others such as Bodmer and colleagues and Studeris and colleagues. And the key publication here, I think, is in its original German, not here. I think it's Construction of a Questionnaire, APD, for Assessing Abnormal and Mental States. And you can see it went through something similar to the MEQ, right? It went through this timeline of revision. So it started out as one scale in 1975. It got changed in the 90s, and then it got integrated with other scales in 99. And then in 2010, there was a factor analysis of the original OAV scale. So it goes through again. It's one of those empirical state-based schemes that has very clear changes through test theory. The most prominent thing to know from this is that, speaking of the 5-DAC, which is the most prominently used one, is that it suggests 5 dimensions of altered states of consciousness. So oceanic boundlessness, dread of ego dissolution, visionary restructuralization, auditory alterations, and vigilance reduction. Now, the 3 in bold represent the 3 that were proposed in the APZ and OAV. The 5-DASC added auditory alterations and vigilance reduction. And since the 11-ASC was a factor analysis of the OAV, the 11-ASC itself only deals with 3 dimensions. It does not deal with auditory alterations or vigilance reduction. It is important to note that the 11-ASC is not a separate questionnaire. The 11-ASC is a scoring scheme for the 5-DASC. So if you use it, you would give the entire 5-DASC, but only score a certain amount of items. Some of the factors that the 11-ASC does talk about are, for example, blissful state, anxiety, complex imagery. And these factors are comprised of items that are only related to one dimension. So blissful state is a factor of oceanic boundlessness, anxiety is a factor of dread of ego dissolution, and complex imagery is a factor of visionary restructuralization. On the left, you can see a recent publication that I did with a colleague of mine where we used the 5D-AC and kind of showed it on a radar plot. So you can see how psilocybin compared to a calcium placebo on the subjective effects. Moving on from that, we have the empirical phenomenological approach. This was done by Ronald Bacala. As you can see, another empirical state-based scheme here. It began as the phenomenology of consciousness questionnaire, then became the dimensions of conscious questionnaire, and became the PCI. Now, it did this actually quite rapidly because unlike the 5DAC and the MEQ, which had revisions done throughout many years, throughout multiple decades, the PCI did this all within the 80s. So from 81 to 86, it was completely refined and finished. And here on the left, you can see some of these dimensions that it's using. It suggests, for example, that there's positive affect, negative affect, altered experience, visual imagery, attention, self-awareness, altered state of awareness, internal dialogue, rationality, volitional control, memory, and arousal. And if that wasn't enough, they also have 14 minor dimensions. So, for example, positive affect has joy as one of them. Anger is almost like a factor, right, of negative affect. We don't say factor because I don't know if they were derived statistically the same way the 11AC was. But the point is that they're basically dimensions that are also composed of subdimensions to some degree. And you can see on the left here, this is how it is shown empirically from a paper that Timo was on, looking at, I think, flicker light. There was also another one suggested by Ralph Metzner. This is another two-dimensional scheme, very simple in the sense of arousal and hedonia. So how excited is somebody versus how pleasurable an experience feels. Metzner was a psychotherapist and a researcher who worked with Leary and Richard Alpert, who was another famous psychedelic researcher. He studied ayahuasca shamanism and explored the transformative power of narrative in myths. The strange thing about this is there was a questionnaire kind of related to this scheme called the Altered States Graphic Profile. It never took off. Now, this scheme you're going to see in a book that he published in 2005, or he wrote a chapter for a book in 2005. But the questionnaire for it was invented back in 86. So the assumption is that this plot was around in 86. The idea is, as I said, that the states of consciousness are mapped on a degree of pleasure and energy. And the important thing here, which is really unique, is that the arousal dimension is taken directly from the cartography of ecstatic and meditative states. So he was really inspired by Fisher, and this whole arousal dimension here was inspired directly from his work on the cartography of ecstatic and meditative states. In 1992, you have what I would call sort of the more modern Ludwig. So Ludwig compiled his 66 characteristics because he was just reading a bunch of work on altered states and found that was sort of the review paper on it, right? Farthing does this in the 90s. He basically looks over all of this work on altered states and he says, yes, actually, there's 14 dimensions of changed subjective experiences in altered states, and his attention, perception, imagery, fantasy, inner speech, memory, higher level thought, meaning, significance of experiences, time experience, emotional feeling expression, levels of arousal, self-control, suggestibility, body image, and sense of personal identity. So I think this might be the one with the most dimensions that we've reviewed, but he basically was reading all the literature up before the 90s and extracted these 14. Metzner kind of returns again here because in that same book chapter that I mentioned, he kind of writes this, what he would call the general heuristic model, which is something that is about showing the time course of an altered state, how it's altered, but he importantly talks about its alterations. There are some method-based elements here, but ultimately it's important that he says that there's alterations in thinking attitude, feeling emotion, perception sensation, sense of time space, body image, sense of self, and identity. There's also, as we go into the 2000s, the four-dimensional consciousness state space in the psychobiology of altered states. It is they called it the four-dimensional descriptive system, but it essentially is the phenomenological reference system that goes towards constructing a consciousness state space, right? So there's four dimensions, and in this space, you can map the movement through these dimensions, the changes in these dimensions. So there's activation, which is the readiness to interact with your environment, your awareness span, the range of your focus and attention, self-awareness, the reflective aspect of experience, and sensory dynamics, which is changes in sensory perception. Now, in 2017, we have the three-dimensional consciousness state space. So this was suggested by Aviva Berkovich-Ohana, Joseph Glickson originally in 2014, I believe. And then it was extended to altered states of consciousness by Berkovich-Ohana and Mark Whitman. So the idea is that ASC phenomenology can be accounted for within a three-dimensional space where you have time, affect, and awareness. A good example of this is feelings of timelessness in some altered states of consciousness that can be described by a collapse of the time dimension. So LSD, meditation, all sort of affect this and collapse sort of this dimension of time. But there is also restricted, there's like hyper awareness, and there's also changes in pleasant affect that come along with it, right? So you could see in these last two, we started moving to this consciousness, this CSS system. Now, there were some omitted classification schemes in the state-based ones. So there's some that stem from Buddhism that we do not talk about, some that stem from the I Ching, astrology, alchemy, tantra, and tarot. These are covered a little bit by Charles Tart in his book in 1975, but Metzner covers them in Maps of Consciousness pretty extensively. There were some that stemmed from Freudian Jungian concepts that we didn't cover. So Fromm, for example, some that were generalized and not directly applicable. So that would be Jane's bicameral mind work, which is still an interesting read. Pauletti and Ben Selson's, they had a state space model similar to Whitman's. And then there were some preliminary or underdeveloped ones. So Shulgin details a way that he classified his drug experiments on himself by just giving them variations of 1+, 2+, or 3+, but it's nothing enough to be a classification scheme, but essentially a proto one. Now we're moving into the method-based schemes. There's not very many of these ones because they seem to have evolved in the neurophysio-based ones. But these essentially are categorizations of altered states of consciousness by induction methods, and they usually differentiate primarily between pharmacological and non-pharmacological approaches. So whether you're taking a drug to enter the altered state or not, and there's various terminology here used, such as conscious modifying techniques or productions of altered states. There's also very unique terminology for the non-pharmacological induction methods, such as laboratory psychonautics, technologies of the sacred, induction procedures, induction techniques, psychological or physiological maneuvers, and induced by other means. The first one we're going to cover here, we're going to return back to Charles Tart. In that same book, he outlines the systems model of altered states, which I think is a very, if not the most relevant method-based scheme that we're going to cover. Basically, it details that there is a baseline state of consciousness that is the default state that is maintained by a certain configuration of structures and systems. And I would mention that this is very classical cognitive psychology, because if you look to your left, you can see that cognitive psychologists love shapes. They love triangles and squares and hexagons, pentagons, everything, and they love turning them around in different ways. And this is what Tart did. He was sort of mapping this out. So you can see there's the BSOC. This is the baseline state of consciousness. Is comprised by a configuration of structures and systems represented by the shapes, right? Then you have disruptive forces that break the integrity of that configuration. This leads to a transitional period where patterning forces begin the configuration of a new altered state. And then this discrete altered state is a new configuration based on the changed systems and structures. De-induction is just this process in reverse. Right, so for example, sensory homogenization. So for example, multimodal Ganzfeld, where you wear the ping pong goggles, look into red light, listen to static noise. This is a disruptive force from your normal everyday stuff. It starts disrupting the baseline state, breaks the configuration of the baseline state, and during this new transitional period in the multimodal Ganzfeld, a new state begins to emerge. Because there's a time course there. ASC phenomenon doesn't happen immediately in the multimodal Ganzfeld. It happens after several minutes where you can have the emergence of complex imagery, right? So there's clearly a time period, a transitioning period where you break the baseline state and the new altered state is sort of configuring. We also will return to Dietrich here. So in addition to creating the conceptual framework that led to the 5D ASC, he did suggest a two-dimensional sort of method-based scheme that is basically mostly detailing the strength of a stimulus, so how strong and variable it is. So for example, sensory deprivation is low variability, low intensity, and the idea is that the more you drift away from the middle of this, the more likely you are to create some sort of altered state. So sensory overload, for example, moves from the middle of this graph here. And as it moves to the extremes, your likelihood for having an altered state increases. A very simple one, it hasn't been followed up to our knowledge. We also have induction domain schemes here. We'll return a bit to Vital and colleagues and Coffray and colleagues here. And this was a way to classify ASC induction methods by assigning them to distinct domains. So, in the Vital et al. Paper, if you look to the far left on table 2, they have either spontaneously occurring, physically, physiologically induced, psychologically induced, or disease induced, or pharmacologically induced. This is from Vital's induction domain classification. And then Coffray and colleagues suggest another one, which has you have either natural or endogenous altered states, pharmacological altered states, induced by other means altered states, or pathological altered states. An example would be that LSD would clearly be a pharmacologically induced altered state, and that sleep, according to Coffray and others, is a natural endogenous altered state. Now, of course, this brings up discussions on whether sleep is an altered state, whether these psychiatric conditions are altered states, which we kind of talked about at the beginning. We also have this neuro-based nomenclature, neuroscience-based nomenclature, which was suggested by Zohar and colleagues as a response to issues with previous drug classifications outlined by David Nutt. So the idea here is this is a scheme that allows for criteria that integrates modern neuroscience findings to create a naming system that presents a clear rationale to provider and patients for selecting a certain drug. So for example, desipramine is a tricyclic antidepressant reuptake inhibitor that acts on norepinephrine. Now, this is not necessarily an altered state of conscious-inducing drug, but the idea is that all drug classifications can, to some level, be considered method-based schemes of ASC classification. Furthermore, you can also see them as a transition to neurophysio-based schemes, because the first phase of getting to these schemes is that when working with drugs, is that you identify the mechanism of the drug and the pathway that the drug takes at a molecule receptor level. Then from that, you can then start to understand neurobiological and physiological pathways within the organism, which can lead to the suggestion of neurophysio-based schemes. So yes, method-based schemes and neurophysio-based schemes are very heavily linked together. And in some ways, you can see neurophysio-based schemes as being the evolution of method-based schemes. These schemes specifically suggest classification via neurobiological and physiological mechanisms of altered states of consciousness. So at the neuro level, maybe brain entropy, functional connectivity, and brain dynamics. At the computational level, information processing, which we will detail later. And physiological level, suggestions that blood CO2 concentration and heart rate entropy may suggest altered states. Refinement of these schemes can be applied to broader classification schemes. So for example, if you refine those, you can use these to further refine method-based, as I previously mentioned. They can also help to narrow the explanatory gap of subjective phenomenon when refined along state-based schemes through the identification of neurocorrelates of consciousness. So for example, we cannot say that something can fully be, a feeling can be fully explained by reduction to simple neurobiological or physiological processes. So this will not solve the hard problem of consciousness, but there is this gap between the state-based and method-based, right? And the neurophysio-based. As you refine these classifications, that gap will start shrinking, right? But very unlikely that it gets rid of it entirely, although who knows, maybe. The cortical striatothalamo-cortical loop feedback theory is the first one that we're going to be talking about. It was worked on by researchers such as Vollenweider, Avram, and Preller to explain psychedelic drug action through functional connectivity involving the thalamus. So the idea is that ASC phenomenon arises to the thalamus connectivity with the cerebral cortex being either hyperconnected or hypoconnected, which this can inform ASC classification. So for example, we can say that psychedelic drugs disrupt thalamic filtering, which causes the CST-C loop to become hyperconnected. Research suggests that multimodal Ganzfeld, for example, produces ASC phenomenon by causing this loop to be hypoconnected. So it does seem that the sort of homeostatic balance of this loop being proper is what brings about or keeps maintained the baseline state of consciousness. It's only when this loop becomes hyperconnected through psychedelic drugs, for example, or hypoconnected through something like multimodal Ganzfeld, do you start having the emergence of altered states phenomenon. Now, I do want to explain very briefly in this picture here on the side that it is some sort of subdivision with the thalamus interacting with subdivisions of the cerebral cortex, so the prefrontal cortex and the sensorimotor cortex. But we have not yet located which subdivisions of the thalamus are responsible here, and I do believe Timo's been doing some work on this to help inform that. The hierarchical alteration scheme was suggested by Vital and colleagues, so we're also returning to them. So yes, they have a state-based scheme, a method-based scheme, and a neurophysio-based scheme. So they cover all the boxes to suggest an overall neurobiological hierarchy at the core of altered state induction. This is essentially just displaying interdependence between neurobiological mechanisms that are illustrated through alterations in brain tissue, neurotransmitter balance, synchronization and connectivity, arousal and cognitive functions in an altered state of consciousness. And these levels are self-control, arousal, sensory input, neurochemical, metabolic processes, brain dynamics, and structural brain tissue. So for example, LSD leads to cascading effects up and down this hierarchy. It shows changes in functional connectivity, implication of the 5-HT2A receptor, as well as documented sensory changes, self-control changes, and changes in arousal. So it's just sort of a very broad snapshot of all the things that could possibly be happening in the brain in regard to altered state mechanisms. The entropic brain hypothesis was proposed by Robin Carhart Harris. This is a neurophysio-based scheme that aims to index entry into an altered state by measuring the randomness of neuronal firing or entropy in a cortical hierarchical system. And criticality here represents a system poised for change between order and disorder, meaning it is highly malleable. So the scheme we have sort of shown here in two ways. A represents how it is originally shown in 2014. B represents how it was revised in 2018. So basically you can say you have primary consciousness, which represents altered states. Then you have secondary consciousness, which starts representing more psychiatric disorders, right? Now the baseline state is poised right between this point of criticality and primary consciousness. So it's right before the point of criticality. The idea here is this means the baseline state is maximally sensitive to change, which means it can then either bounce into primary consciousness or secondary consciousness, right? And it's this point of criticality that separates the primary from the secondary. So secondary states are low entropy states. So these ones that are extremely low in neuronal firing and the randomness and disorder. And these actually represent disorders of consciousness like coma. They can lead to unconsciousness that way. And then ASCs are the high entropy primary states. So high neuronal firing, high randomness. One way of viewing this is that in the revision, we take this sort of bar and we turn it into a circle. And we do this to show a critical zone, right? The point of criticality is no longer a line, but a zone that is created through the upper and lower bounds of secondary consciousness at the bottom and primary consciousness at the top. And the baseline state exists somewhere into this critical zone, but because of this sort of limit on the upper and lower bound, we now have a state range. So as entropy increases, we can map altered states all throughout this critical zone, and it gives them sort of more room to breathe and more room to sort of classify and map them, right? So this was the reason behind B, right, is because Carhart Harris wanted to say there's a bigger zone where we can map out these different altered states. So for example, LSD consumption increases the randomness of neuronal firing in the cortical hierarchy such that overall disorder increases. Then this maximally sensitive critical zone starts moving upwards towards primary consciousness because we're having an increase in entropy and out of the baseline state. And then in this space, they're starting to enter a primary state of consciousness. And important here is that uncertainty equals information content, right? So primary states are qualitatively rich where secondary states are not. This means that the degree of entropy also suggests that there's a high degree of phenomenological content, right? So if you have a high entropy altered state of consciousness, you're going to have a very subjectively intense altered state. So think DMT, for example, very high entropy, very high phenomenological content, like seeing demons and gods and angels and things. And the last one we'll cover here is the Bayesian predictive coding models. These models generally view that altered states are the disruption of probabilistic learning and statistical inference that are following Bayes' theorem. These are worked on by researchers such as Correlates, Friston, and Carhart Harris. This scheme basically shows that the brain uses generative models to predict future events for efficient perception and action. This is essentially A, you have a cluster. This is A represents the cortical hierarchy. The black squares represent clusters of neurons. And you can see there's this sort of cortical interplay as they're sending information up and down the hierarchy. Within this hierarchy, there are superficial pyramidal cells and deep pyramidal cells. One is thought to encode top-down information. So this is information that is our expectation, our beliefs are top-down. And then the other is to encode bottom-up. And when I say bottom-up, I mean sensory information, incoming sensory information. So top-down, think beliefs, expectations. Bottom-up, think incoming sensory information, right? So these top-down predictions, we call them priors. This bottom-up sensory input we call likelihood, and with those we do a Bayesian computation that computes an outcome posterior. So this is how the brain is thought to, through neuronal firing and information processing, predict an efficient perception or efficient action. They take a top-down prior, they combine it with the bottom-up likelihood, and they compute a percept or compute an action or an outcome with the posterior, right? The errors that happen between these predictions and the sensory input can come back and update the priors. And so there's a feedback loop. And that computational disruption of the balance, of the current balance we all have now, assuming we are all in a sort of baseline state right now, can lead to ASC phenomenon. So if the top-down information becomes too prominent, it will dominate the hierarchy and lead to an altered state. If the bottom-up information becomes too dominant, it will lead to an altered state. It can produce things like hallucinations or delusions. So an example of this is that hallucinations on one end are thought to be the result of relaxed priors. And these are priors that have very weak precision. If you look at B and you look at ASC mechanisms, you can see that we have the dark line, the bell curve, representing the computed output, and then the dotted lines are representing the priors and whatnot. You can see that they've changed, right? And you can see that overall what has happened is that the prior is a lot more flat now. It is relaxed. And what this has done is disrupted the harmony in this balance. And with this thick bottom-up arrow at the bottom of that one, you can see it's bigger because you now have this influx of stronger bottom-up sensory signals. So you have an increase in ascending prediction error, and because there's not matches happening with the information, and then you have this extremely strong bottom-up sensory input, right? This is what the Rebus model shows us. The Rebus, the relaxed beliefs under psychedelics model, which was Carr, Harris, and Friston. Now, I will note that that model is also not just Bayesian. It also uses entropic brain hypothesis. So it's just an addition. It's just the addition of another parameter. So it's EBH plus Bayesian predictive coding. That is what Rebus is. It is just EBH plus this additional parameter, right? Now, there is another thought that hallucinations and delusions are not the result of relaxed priors that are leading to the dominance of sensory information, that it's actually strong priors with strong precision that is causing interpretation to be biased towards expectation that is leading to these percepts. So in this case, the prior is too strong and it disrupts the hierarchy such that it's constraining the bottom-up information too much, and your ideas of reality are now distorted because your priors and expectation are so strong in dominating the information flow. And that is thought to lead to hallucinations. So to wrap all of this up, we went through all the state-based classification schemes, and we decided to cluster across, I think, 103 terms, all from state-based, right? So we're only talking about subjective phenomenon here. And from this, we created 8 clusters. We termed each of the words, and in the preprint, there's an appendix that shows you how we coded these. And we had the idea of here, perception and imagery is the first cluster. As you can see, these are the words that represent that cluster. The bigger the word, the more it appeared. So for example, imagery perception, you could also see exteroception, synesthesia, elementary imagery, meaning, fantasy, whatever. That would be in the first one. In the second one, we have the bodily sense cluster. You can see dominated by body image. In the third, we have self-boundary. So that is dominated by words like boundary, but also involves unity, space, sense of space, awareness. We have mystical significance as the fourth cluster, which involves mystical meaning, awe, and affability. We have arousal, which is just dealing with hypo alertness activation. Time sense, which is referring to transcendence of time, the subjective experience of time. And then affect, which is just emotion broadly. So it's either positive, negative, bliss, love, anger, joy, sadness, all of these. And then we have the eighth one, which is cognition, which is a very broad cluster that could involve anything from memory to control to attention to behavior and awareness. There was an attempt at this recently done by Yaden and colleagues at Hopkins in my home state of Maryland, where they looked through psychedelic questionnaires and decided to kind of sort the items and dimensions into these groups. Now, these two papers sort of complement each other, right? Because Yaden's approach is a lot more narrow. It focuses only on psychedelic drugs and it focuses only on questionnaires. Our approach focused more on altered states generally, and when it came to questionnaires, we handled them by explaining them in terms of frameworks, of general frameworks that have different iterations of questionnaires. And so when you put these things together, you are looking at sort of the hunt for clinically relevant effects, right? So Yaden was looking for these acute subjective effects of psychedelics. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, that we are kind of the state-based schemes allow you to identify clinically relevant dimensions of experience for psychedelic-assisted therapy. So that is the talk. You can look at the preprint here or the tutorial here with these QR codes. There was a tutorial we gave in Japan, so that is on ResearchGate. And then the preprint that this talk was based on is on the QR to the left. I would like to thank my PI, Dr. Athena Demertzi, Dr. Timo Schmidt, who's here in this call, colleagues Cyril Kosteins, and Dr. Mark Whitman at Freiburg. And we are ready for any discussion if we can have it.